Короче говоря, вы очень хорошо знакомы с темой войны. Что нас может ждать в будущем в связи с этими событиями?
Следующий шаг для путинский режим, что открывать ГУЛАГ, настоящий ГУЛАГ опять в России. Я абсолютно согласен. So, he's been very good at sending these signals ever since Maidan that, if you try this stuff with me, вам пиздец.
Но это, в общем, очень мощное определение.
I think it would be perfectly legitimate to call Putin's regime a fascist regime.
Пропаганда — это же наркоз. Она помогает человеку не чувствовать какую-то реальность.
Это будет еще сложнее. Это факт, абсолютно. Always Russia that has gone further and further and further and further in this madness. Это что? Это что? Survive a nuclear war?
Вы много работали на разных войнах, и вы их много исследовали. Ваш роман «Благоволительницы», который о Второй мировой войне, вышел тиражом более 1 миллиона копий по всему миру, переведен на 20 языков или больше. Также вы были в Чечне, я знаю, и написали книгу «Чечня. Год третий». Кроме того, вы сняли документальный фильм «Неправильные элементы» о том, как в Уганде работала армия сопротивления, в которую вербовали детей. И помимо всего этого, вы еще 7 лет работали в благотворительной организации «Действия против голода», которая помогала пострадавшим от войны и в Афганистане, в той же Чечне, в Боснии и в других странах. Короче говоря, вы очень хорошо знакомы с темой войны. И именно поэтому я попросил вас об интервью, чтобы вы помогли мне и другим понять то, что сейчас происходит в Украине, как нам это осмыслять, что нас может ждать в будущем в связи с этими событиями. С самого начала я хотел задать вопрос. Собственно, вы ожидали такого поворота событий?
I think since the fall, when especially the American government has been releasing its intelligence, saying extremely openly that there would be a full invasion of Ukraine, I believed it fairly fast. I am fairly familiar with the way the US government works in regards to its public announcements and its intelligence. And it was pretty obvious to me quite quickly that they would not be making such statements if they did not have extremely valid reasons to say so. Obviously I didn't want to believe it, but I did believe it. Because then when they kept repeating it, it seemed to me that they are doing so for very specific reasons. Obviously, they were trying to discourage it from happening. I was convinced from the beginning they would never have said these things if they weren't certain it was true. I didn't believe people who were saying that it was just propaganda and so forth, because it's just the way the systems work in America are such that to go this high and this strongly in terms of the statements President Biden was making that fast indicated to me that they had very, very seriously concerned about this possibility. And then, of course, everything we saw coming from Putin was not particularly reassuring either. The statements he was making up to the last days, Council of the Совбез that we saw, his last обращение, where he was talking about, what he believed to be the non-existent Ukrainian state. It became pretty obviously that unfortunately they had decided to launch a massive war of aggression, full war for a full invasion of Ukraine.
Просто здесь никто не верил в то, что это возможно, вплоть до первой атаки. Даже те, кто не смотрит государственные каналы и кто не верит пропаганде, все равно думали, что это невообразимое что-то.
Это прекрасно понимаю. Даже в Украине они это не поняли, не хотели это понять. Все мои друзья в Украине сказали, нет, это не будет. Какое-то решение найдется. Власть Украины, конечно, официально показала, что они не думают, что это будет, что the Americans are exaggerating or the situation is not that bad. Obviously, many people were looking at small details about whether they're moving fuel or blood supplies or field hospitals. I read some of the specialized literature and it was pretty clear they were slowly moving up what they needed to prepare a full invasion, which is also a very technical matter.
Я знаю, что у вас есть друзья и знакомые в Украине. В какой момент вы им сказали, вот сейчас точно пора уезжать?
Это не я им сказал. Они все уехали, когда уже начиналось, к сожалению. Единственный мой друг, который в Паране уехал, работает в ООН, и он получил приказ от своего начальства. В понедельник, по-моему, он получил приказ, что он должен эвакуировать свою семью. Это был просто приказ. Он не хотел, потому что его жена украинка, он нет, он из Европы. Он оставил здесь семью, и он уже обратно на границе Украины, чтобы работать и помогать.
Вчера впервые за много лет мой психоаналитик отменил нашу встречу. И я сразу подумал, что это связано с войной. Сейчас мы все пытаемся как-то осмыслить то, что происходит, и понять, какие у этой катастрофы могут быть последствия. Понимать что-либо получается с большим трудом, потому что это гигантская неопределенность и скорость, с которой все меняется, заставляют мозги перегреваться. Многие, и я в том числе, испытывают много разных очень сильных эмоций. Весь этот коктейль эмоций часто находит выход в агрессии. Такое количество хейтерских комментариев и каких-то агрессивных сообщений, которые мне приходят в последние дни, я не получал, мне кажется, никогда. И это понятно. Это защитная реакция нашей психики на все, что происходит вокруг. Мне кажется, что если вынести за скобки вопрос самой базовой безопасности, то психологическое здоровье – это самое главное, потому что без него невозможно рационально действовать, быть полезным окружающим и самому себе. Поэтому мне кажется, что вместо этих ссор и этой агрессии и разговоров с коллегами, друзьями и родителями, которые могут привести к скандалу, самый важный разговор, который может каждый из нас провести, это разговор с хорошим психотерапевтом. И я в этом убеждаюсь на собственном опыте, потому что, когда сегодня, наконец, мы встретились с моим аналитиком, я вышел с этой встречи в гораздо лучшем состоянии, чем когда заходил к нему. Потому что разговор с психологом — это не просто разговор, где ты можешь выговориться и как-то успокоиться. Это сеанс терапии, когда ты можешь посмотреть на собственные мысли и собственные страхи и другие сильные эмоции как бы со стороны, понять их и прожить их. И таким образом психология действительно исцеляет, особенно в такие тяжелые моменты. Поэтому, когда я вышел с сеанса анализа, я, по крайней мере, смог вернуться к работе и сделать то самое интервью, которое вы сейчас смотрите. Поэтому, если у вас нет своего психолога, я, как и прежде, рекомендую вам сервис онлайн-терапии Ясно Лайф. Мне кажется, это лучший способ начать психотерапию. У платформы Ясно Лайф есть несколько очень удобных, полезных качеств. Здесь алгоритмы после небольшого опроса подберут и предложат вам наиболее подходящих психологов. А если вам захочется более точно подыскать специалиста, то поможет служба поддержки. Деньги списываются за 12 часов до сессии, это помогает преодолеть сопротивление. И за сутки вам еще придет напоминание, чтобы вы точно не пропустили оплаченную консультацию. Еще очень важно, что все психотерапевты на Ясно Лайф имеют как минимум 3-летний стаж опыта работы с клиентами и хорошее образование. Занятия онлайн экономят очень много времени, и самое главное, вы можете заниматься где угодно, вдалеке от дома. Сессия на Ясно Лайф стоит 2850 рублей, а с промокодом КАРЕН вы получаете скидку 20% на первую сессию. Мне кажется, именно информационная война и пропаганда в этих событиях играют суперважную роль. Тут я хочу поговорить про термин «фашизм», который у нас много используют сейчас. И сегодня, например, министр обороны России Сергей Шойгу заявил, что первый международный антифашистский конгресс пройдет в дни работы форума «Армия-2022». По его словам, этот конгресс, я сейчас прям процитирую, призван объединить усилия международного сообщества в борьбе с идеологией нацизма, нео-нацизма в любых формах его проявления. И вообще Путин и вся российская телевизионная пропаганда называют вторжение в Украину борьбой с неонацизмом и с хунтой, захватившей власть в Киеве. И вот меня очень интересует эта манипуляция терминами нацизм, фашизм, которые вообще для Украины и для России, конечно, значат очень много, учитывая нашу историю. Вы, как писатель и исследователь Второй мировой, как автор «Благоволительниц», как вам кажется, насколько вообще эти термины неонацизм, фашизм, насколько они уместны в лексиконе российских военных прямо сейчас? Было ли такое во Вторую мировую, чтобы эти термины использовались для оправдания захвата, для насилия?
I'm really happy that Shoigu wants to, I have this sentence here in English, wants to unite the efforts of the international community in the fight against the ideology of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and any form of its manifestation in the modern world. Because actually that's what Shoigu has done in the past few days. He's united the entire international community in a fight against fascism and neo-Nazism. The problem is the fascism and neo-Nazism he's united them against is Russian fascism and Russian neo-Nazism. Because today, the fact is that the foremost manifestation in the world of fascism and neo-Nazism is the Russian government. Obviously, in every Western country, there are neo-Nazi movements. There are extreme right nationalist movements, white nationalist movements, racist movements, fascist movements. We have them in the United States, we have them in France, we have them in Germany, we have them in England. They exist everywhere. But except for the United States, where because of Trump they took on a huge importance, everywhere else they are very much a minority proposition, are not much more than a nuisance, an annoyance. Even in France, what we call the extreme right parties, like the Front National of Marine Le Pen, has been trying for years and years and years to move away from the genuine extremists, the genuine neo-Nazis and fascists, and sort of, become a sort of more mainstream hard right party. In Ukraine, there has also been very much a phenomenon of neo-Nazism and extreme right. But in Ukraine, it's a very complicated phenomenon because it's a whole spectrum. Neo-nationalists or nationalists who are nationalists. They love their country, and the people from Western Ukraine love their country in a very certain specific way, with a tradition of resistance against the Soviets, going back to the Second World War, of people who were associated with Germany and who were associated with fascism. So there is that tradition, what's called the banderci. But also the real fascists in Ukraine, like everywhere else, are football hooligans. It's these S-14 people and these people. But they're as irrelevant to Ukraine as they are everywhere else. They're just a bunch of stupid skinheads who go around beating people up. Period. In the last election in Ukraine, since we're going to talk specifically about Ukraine, in 2019, all the right-wing parties, the extreme right-wing parties of Ukraine, united. I don't know how they did it, because for the extreme right-wing to unite is incredibly complicated, because they all want to be the vozhd, of course. They somehow managed to unite for the parliamentary elections to present a common list, hoping that they would get into parliament. Even with that, they did not get into parliament. They never made it to 5%. Every single right-wing party in Ukraine united, which means the political importance of right-wing extremism and hard nationalism in Ukraine is exactly null. This is a fact. And it's proved by elections, because in the democracy, that's how it works. Political forces express their strength through elections. Russia, I think, has been sliding. Obviously, it didn't start that way, but Putin's regime has been sliding into many things that are extremely characteristic of what we globally call fascism in the 20th century. Now, fascism is a complicated word. It gets thrown around a lot. People use it in many different ways. It means many different things. Originally and technically, it was a political movement, ultra hard right nationalist movement in Italy. That's where the word comes from. The Nazis, for instance, didn't call themselves fascists. They called themselves national socialists, because what they wanted to show was how they were uniting social policy towards German workers with hard nationalist ideas to counter the Bolsheviks. So each one of these movements in the 30s and 40s had their own different emphasis, their own different way of thinking about this. Now we call them all fascist, but the Croatian fascists, so forth in every country. So how do you define fascism is a huge discussion. But basically, if you consider it to mean, attempts to install full control over your own society with no democratic legitimacy, imposing control over your society by force, by arresting people, imprisoning them, repressing them, killing them, and then using the power you've gained internally to also impose your will through the use of power or war externally, then that would be a fairly relatively good definition of the fascist regimes of the 30s and of the Russian regime today, especially in many of its internal characteristics and also in the way it behaves internationally. I think it would be perfectly legitimate to call Putin's regime a fascist regime.
Но это, в общем, очень мощное определение. Для многих в России оно будет звучать слишком жестко и дико.
I mean, yes, I agree with you. It's a very harsh judgment. And I wouldn't have probably have made that judgment, a couple of years ago. Called it an authoritarian regime. I would have called it, authoritarian regime. But after, the sequence of events, it starts with the poisoning of Navalny, the closing of the last civil society institutions in Russia like Memorial, so the closing down of every form of expression, not just of dissent, but even of just historical research and memory, the complete rewriting in a mythical manner of the Russian past, which is why they're closing down Memorial, so they can continue to build up the myth of Stalin and the Great Patriotic War. And then using all this myth and this propaganda, plus, of course, the Great Slavic, the Union of Nations, Ukraine is not an independent country, is a natural part of the same thing as Russia, and so forth and so forth. So this great Russian, practically racial ideology that anybody who's racially Russian should be considered Russian and should be part of the territory of Russia. These are all clear markers of the same thing that we called fascism in the 1930s and the 1940s. I mean, Hitler began his aggressive conquests 3 years before he invaded the Soviet Union by claiming he had a right to annex territory where ethnic Germans lived. So he started with the Sudetenland, he started with Austria, because these are ethnic Germans. Then he expanded and expanded and expanded. It's the same process with Putin. He's saying they're ethnic Russians in Ukraine, so we not only have to defend them, they have to be part of Russia because they're ethnic Russians. Then he says all Ukrainians are ethnic Russians because there is no such thing as Ukrainians, which is obviously a complete fantasy. And dalsze. I'm expecting him also to say maybe the northern half of Kazakhstan should be part of Russia because it's also very much populated by ethnic Russians. And of course, he can then use this argument against the Baltic states and, other places on the periphery of Russia and its current borders. So yes, it may seem like a very harsh judgment to the people watching us, but I think that today, in this situation, and what is happening now, where he has provoked the first unprovoked, unnecessary war of aggression on the European continent since World War II, since 80 years, he is behaving exactly like Hitler was behaving in 1938, 1939. He's doing the same thing with the same discourse, the same ideology, except replacing Germans with Russians, but it's the same thing, and the same elements of language, and the same lack of justification, and the same just open, naked aggression. Fuck you, we don't care, we're just going to do it, and stop us.
Другое слово из этого лексикона, Путин, часто называет украинское правительство хунтой. Однако, конечно, весь мир наблюдал Украину последние 30 лет, и это редкая постсоветская страна, где происходили свободные выборы и там разные другие демократические процессы. Была сменяемость власти. Однако значительная часть российского населения, и те, кто смотрит телевизор в основном, верят в миф про хунту и неонацистов во главе Украины. Как пропаганда настолько мощно влияет, изменяя реальность в голове такого огромного количества людей? Вообще, может ли пропаганда таким образом победить реальность? И к чему она ведет? Потому что пропаганда — это же наркоз. Она помогает человеку не чувствовать какую-то реальность, но она при этом не меняет эту реальность. Что может происходить дальше в стране, вот, учитывая все, что вы сказали про амбиции власти, так сказать, защитить этнических русских в других странах и для этого вводить туда войска и так далее. При этом у нас внутри страны работает такая пропаганда. И куда все это нас может привести, учитывая тот исторический опыт, который вам известен?
It's obviously a very interesting point you raise, and there are many points in what you've just said. Concerning obviously calling the Ukrainian government a junta, it's pretty funny. I mean, Ukraine is the one country in the former Soviet Union, not counting the Balts, of course, that has had free and open elections and power change over these past 30 years, as you said yourself. I was there for Zelensky's election. It was a free and fair and open election, and there were two very serious and strong opponents, Poroshenko and Zelensky won. And actually, even funnier is that the neo-nationalists, the hard right, was very much against Zelensky. They hate him, not because he's Jewish, but because he's a Russian speaker. They were all for Poroshenko. So, Zelensky won, and that's all. It's a phenomenon I've noted with dictators, with tyrants. I actually wrote about this in my book, in The Kindly Ones. If you look at their insults, at the language they use about their opponents, you find that very often, I've discovered this reading Mein Kampf with Hitler, and I wrote about it in the book, that very often the words they use, the specific terms they use, actually reflect very much their own insecurities about themselves. So what they accuse their opponents of doing, or being, is very much how they're secretly afraid that they are themselves. This was extremely obvious with Donald Trump. I mean, his entire vocabulary about weakness, pettiness, lying, cheating, which he accuses all his opponents with, is obviously very much what he is in his very essence and being. So when Putin, who runs, the biggest junta in the region, calls the Ukrainians a junta, it's also an unconscious expression of his own nature. I believe this very seriously. Concerning the propaganda in Russia, obviously it's a huge problem. The first thing he did when he came to power, I was still living in Russia at the time, was take over NTV. I remember NTV when it was a free and completely objective television that people could get real news from during, for instance, the entire first Chechen war. And one of the very first things he did at the beginning of 2000 was arrest Kuczynski, kick him out of the country and take over NTV. And then it followed, through the creation of Russia Today and so forth and so forth. Первый канал got very quickly, cracked down, Kiselyov and all that machine. What surprised me then, and really still surprises me now, and maybe you can explain this to me. I mean, there's clearly a division in Russia, between generations, between older people who get their news from television and younger people who get their news from internet. And the people obviously who get their news from internet because they have access to much wider sources. Even if they're reading the Russian internet, they still can't read BBC or New York Times or whatever, and compare the different positions and have a more informed opinion from comparing different sources of media. The older people who are watching only television get their information only from this one source, and therefore would be theoretically more susceptible to this propaganda. The thing that really questions me, my father was a big specialist of Soviet Union. He visited many times. He was a big journalist in the 60s, top editor for Newsweek for Soviet affairs. He was quite a specialist. And he's always told me that in the Soviet Union, nobody believed the television. Nobody believed it. People watched it because it was there, but nobody believed a single word that the news said on television, that the government said. Everybody knew it was all lies. So what I don't understand is how these same people who were young in the Soviet time, who knew in Soviet time not to believe what was on television, now are older people who are watching the same kind of propaganda, obviously much more sophisticated and slicker and better designed and not so crappy as what was done in Soviet times. But still, why do they believe it now and didn't believe it back then? This is a mystery to me, in which I really don't understand.
Well, maybe it's just because they want to defend their psychic, because for that generation, it's totally unbelievable that Russia can invade Ukraine and kill Ukrainian people. So it's kind of psychological defense to me. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
It's not just about Ukraine, it's this entire time, these entire 20 years. Everything they've been fed about Syria, about Navalny, about Nemtsov, all the stuff that they've been lied to about, they seem to believe. I find this very strange. During confinement, I took some more Russian lessons to try to improve a bit my very poor Russian. And I had a very lovely man. He was a very nice teacher at MGU in Moscow, but he was a complete pro-Putin. And I finally just stopped talking politics with him because for me it was incredibly despairing. But he was just like praising Putin, saying Putin was surrounded by the best advisors and was the wisest man. And they always presented him with, 2 or 3 of the best options, and he would choose the best option. I'd be like, Farid, what are you talking about? What are you talking about?
Maybe your father underestimated Soviet trust in media previously. Maybe nothing changed at all.
I don't know. I don't think so. From what I know, like during Afghanistan, everybody knew that what the television was saying was lies. Everybody knew. And people got their information. Obviously, there was no internet during Afghanistan, but people got information through people returning, rumors. There was this whole phenomenon of jokes, which was incredibly important, which seems to have completely disappeared. Although maybe memes have replaced jokes now, I don't know. But, Soviet people had a sense of the reality beyond the alternate reality that their government was trying to manufacture for them, which led to all the events of the 80s. A large segment, at least, of the Russian population today seems to have lost even this basic critical thinking. I'm not saying that we're not lying or that we're always right, but you have to think critically and you have to compare your sources and you have to, if your government says one thing, I certainly don't believe everything Biden or Macron or whoever says, I go and I check other sources and I compare, and just because my government said it doesn't mean I believe it. And they certainly lie a lot about many things, but obviously not on the same scale.
На самом деле то, о чем вы говорите, вот этот раскол между двумя поколениями, он был все эти годы. Но сейчас это очень сильно, конечно, обострилось. И этот раскол происходит часто внутри одной семьи. Я за последние дни слышал несколько историй от своих друзей, когда родители, мама или папа, ссорятся с детьми, отказываются с ними общаться, просто потому что у них радикально противоположные взгляды на эту войну. И я, продолжая все тот же вопрос, пытаюсь судорожно понять, к чему ведет такая поляризация и такой раскол, такая работа пропаганды. Куда, есть в истории какие-то примеры, которые нам подсказывают, что может в связи с этим быть дальше. Потому что очевидно, что пропаганды меньше в ближайшее время не станет. Ее станет только больше.
You know, I don't think it's a split. I don't think the split is only because of the propaganda. I think it goes much, much deeper than that. The two generations you're talking about, the generation of the parents and the generations of the younger people, it's a fact. It's an absolute fact. The generation of the parents, let's say they're my age, okay, 54, maybe 60, maybe 65, or maybe 50. These are all people who ended their adolescence during perestroika, who had their entire youth ravaged by the difficulties of the 90s, you know, no future, no prospects, no career, the besperidial that was in the first half of the 90s, the violence, the economic crisis, the economic catastrophe of 1998, which I was in Russia in 1998, I remember it very well, the first economic crash. These people had all their active years, their years of future, the years where they could develop themselves as people, basically ruined by the geopolitical conflagration of the fall of the Soviet Union. And then when Putin came and calmed things down, rebuilt the economy, which he did. I mean, he really did. It's a fact. The first 10 years, he really developed Russia incredibly. And if he had left power in 2008, as he was supposed to, he would be remembered as the great president who had saved Russia and had rebuilt Russia.
Well, we don't know if it's due to him or due to oil prices, you know?
It was, of course, oil prices, but he used it very intelligently. And he did manage to impose a form of order on an incredibly chaotic Russia at the time. I'm not talking about Chechnya, but, you know, more like just the different regions doing whatever they wanted and the whole criminality, everything. I mean, he did calm the situation down quite a bit. And so the people who had been living through those late 80s and 90s were completely traumatized. By the time they reach middle age, all they want is peace and security. You know, they have no more future. They have no more prospects. The only thing they want is to finish their career, get their pension, and go fishing in the dacha, because that's all that's left of their life anyways. So it's normal that they would have a very conservative position, you know, a pro-Putin one fed by the propaganda, but it's not just only that, it's deeply psychological. Whereas their children who came up in the better times, who had a lot to look forward, who traveled around the world, I'm talking about the middle class obviously, saw other countries, saw how people were living in Spain and Germany and Italy and France, had all these ideas, internet, careers, and want a future that's more comparable to our future. They really thought they had a possibility of that when they were young in the 10s and 20s of this, you know, the past 20 years of this century. And now these prospects are being completely ruined because basically any thinking person in Russia is now left with two choices, which is either shut up and be complicit of a fascist regime or leave the country. Many are leaving, but, you know, not everybody wants to leave their home country. And so for the younger generation, it's an absolutely tragic choice, because to live a normal life in what we, the West, the sense we have of what a normal life is, to be able to do your business without somebody coming and taking your business away because he's paid someone else to let him take your business, you know, without having to pay babki to all the silovikis everywhere you go, with being able to express your opinions freely on internet without being hunted down by bots and trolls, being able to go out in the street and protest your government without being thrown into jail immediately. All these things that we in the West take completely for granted are not available to the younger generation. So I think the split between the two generations is much more fundamental. It's between older, really traumatized generation, traumatized by the fall of the Soviet Union, that just wants peace, internal peace, and the younger generation that really wants a much stronger development of the country, and not just the equivalent in today's terms, basically, of the Brezhnevian stagnation, because what Russia's, never mind the war, but what Russia's heading for internally is late Brezhnev stagnation, which is really unpleasant when you're young and want to build a life for yourself.
Вы упомянули начало нулевых как эпоху роста. И вообще-то тогда был какой-то негласный договор между обществом и властью, что власть дает какую-то гарантию стабильности и процветания. В обмен на это общество не сильно пытается ее менять. В 2014 году, когда случился Крым, появилась совершенно другая риторика. В том числе, конечно, в первую очередь среди пропагандистов, но это была довольно популярная идея, что нам не нужно богатство, нам нужно величие. Мы готовы потерпеть, и мы готовы там, как бы, к санкциям, к каким-то экономическим последствиям, но в обмен теперь уже на великую идею, на идею присоединения Крыма, например, и вообще на идею сильного государства. На мой взгляд, идея сильного государства в постиндустриальную эпоху, она противоречит идее бедности, потому что сильное государство в 21 веке – это государство очень экономически и технологически развитое. Оно не может быть сильным, но бедным. Так, как бы я не могу себе представить такой пример. Как вообще возможен такой переход? Потому что раньше хотя бы за эту стабильность некоторую обещали благополучие, а теперь, особенно сегодня, глядя на те санкции, на курс доллара, на все экономические изменения, которые происходят в последнюю неделю, как бы люди же понимают, что они катастрофически беднеют от всего этого. Как можно в этой ситуации сохранять какую-то лояльность? На что, собственно, рассчитывает тут власть, как вам кажется?
Если мы сначала говорим про 2014 года, про Крым, мне сложно ответить на ваши вопросы, потому что я тогда не был в России. Я сам не наблюдал на эти изменения, я был далеко. Единственное, что я могу сказать, это что между 2000-х и как what you described as, the hope for stability and the economic future, и 2014 года Крым, и Крым наш, и национализма, был 2012 года, и болотное, и все эти процессы. Массовые демонстрации против возвращения Путина на власть. И потом массовая репрессия. Я думаю, что это связано с переводом в 2014 году, потому что тех, которые были репрессированы в 2012 году, извините, это не тех, которые хвалили захвачение Крыма в 2014 году. What the exact connection is difficult for me to say. I mean, I know that in 2014, a lot of nationalists who had strongly criticized Putin, like Limonov or Prilepin or these guys, they all just went right back on Putin's side because they were so happy that he got Crimea back and so forth. But, I think after 2012, when Putin came back to power, I mean, he prepared 2014. The propaganda machine started grinding out after Bolotnaya and all these events incredibly strongly nationalist discourse. And outside of the main cities, outside of where the intelligentsia and the middle class live, I think this propaganda was very effective in the rest of the country. And that's probably the connection with what you describe about 2014 and the rise of this kind of triumphant nationalism. Because a lot of the people saying that, in fact, had never profited from the economic boom of the 2000s. The people outside of Moscow, outside of St. Petersburg, outside of maybe a few other cities in Russia, the people they call the Glumini, were just as poor the whole time, and their lives were just as miserable and just as bad. And so when they're saying, пусть мы будем бедным, но мы будем сильным, at least Putin was giving them something because they'd never had anything anyways. A lot of these people. I mean, I'm not talking about the small right-wing intelligentsia like Prilepin and those guys, but the mass of people that supported this election. How this compares to today is a completely different question. First of all, I don't think anybody sees the kind of enthusiasm about Russia attacking Ukraine today that we saw when they took Crimea in 2014. From the Russian point of view, Crimea was done cleanly. I mean, there were no victims, nobody was killed. It was a very swift operation. And frankly, there were consequences, but they were relatively mild compared to today's consequences. I think the economic collapse that's going to happen in the next month in Russia is going to be as bad, if not worse, than 1998. So this is what we have to compare it with, not 2014. And I don't think there's any appetite for this adventure among the Russian public. It's just that they are being lied to, and many people don't even know there's a war, don't know to what extent it is. But, you can't hide a war forever. I mean, the bodies of all these kids being killed right now, Russian kids, in the streets and the roads of Ukraine, and there are thousands of them apparently already, these bodies have to go back home to villages, to small towns, to Gorodki, to cities where people will receive the bodies and will have funerals and will talk to their comrades, and their comrades will say, Vasya got killed. And I mean, they didn't even tell us we were invading Ukraine, and a day later Vasya was killed. And this is going to spread through the society. The same way Afghanistan, there was no public information, but it spread and diffused through the society. It took 9 years for Soviet Union, to pull out of Afghanistan, but actually the Afghan war is one of the major contributing factors that brought down the Soviet Union, the disaster in Afghanistan.
Да, многие сейчас сравнивают эту войну в Украине с войной в Афганистане. Многие говорят, что это будет путинский Афганистан. И почему он не помнит, чем это все закончилось, что, собственно, это и было начало конца Советского Союза?
Наверное, это потому, что в голове людей, как Путина, Украине слабый, добрый, южный народ, который просто любит танцевать, болтать и покушать, как грузины, например. His representation of Ukrainians and Ukrainian national feeling, I think, was completely off compared to what they really are. They're actually super nice people. They're really, really nice in daily life, but they're the kind of really nice people that get really, really, really tough when things get difficult. I've seen this in other countries too. Говорят, что Афганистан была могила Советского Союза, а может быть, Украина будет могила путинизма, если не Путина.
К вопросу об украинцах как раз мы раньше говорили, что национализм в Украине существует не больше и не меньше, чем в любой другой стране. Но это было справедливо.
Я не сказал национализма, я сказал нео-нацизма. Это разные дела. Украинский национализм – это другой тем. Но я говорил о неонацизме, от фашисты, от скинхедс.
Я тоже говорю о них же, потому что за последнюю неделю я читал много украинских каналов, и я вижу, как там происходит мощнейшая радикализация. Слова про неонацистов, которые произносил Путин, заявляя эту операцию, они похожи теперь уже на самосбывающееся пророчество, потому что, мне кажется, именно благодаря этому вторжению неонацизм стал в Украине довольно масштабным явлением, судя по тому, что я вижу в этих телеграм-каналах. Вот как вам кажется, насколько это стабильное и долговременное явление, насколько это вообще опасно для Украины и для кого-то еще?
I'll make 2 points. The first point is that it has to be clear for everybody that before 2014, Ukrainian neo-Nazis, Ukrainian football radicals, hooligans, skinheads, this whole galaxy of what we call neo-Nazis, were actually all pro-Russian. Okay, they only turned against Russia after 2014, and only then did they start. So before 2014, those people were actually very marginalized. They were much closer to the kind of skinhead neo-Nazi movements in Russia. They actually had a lot of direct communications with them, the kind of neo-Nazi movements that the FSB loves to work with and instrumentalize in the big cities of Russia when they need to, go hunt migrants.
But how come they called Banderovцы, which meant they are against Russia?
No, but Banderovцы is different from the neo-Nazis. You see, that's why I'm trying to explain. These were two different things. You've got the whole Western Ukrainian nationalist tradition, which is not neo-Nazi. It's indeed Banderci. In its origins in the 40s was fascist, although I don't think with all the transformations it went to that the term necessarily applied to all the groups, although it probably did apply even to some of the modern groups. But those groups, the nationalists like UNSO, for example, that sent volunteers to fight in Chechnya in 1995, which was run by Yuri Shukhevich, who was the son of Shukhevich, who was one of the heads of UPA. Okay, these were the West Ukrainian not neo-nationalists, the West Ukrainian Banderci nationalists. This was quite different from all the football hooligans and the actual neo-Nazis, the guys with swastikas and the tattoos, the hard rock, the whole real neo-Nazi complex. All these people gathered together on Maidan and then it got kind of very mixed up during Maidan because they all came to fight. And the ones who had been pro-Russian up to that point obviously switched completely and became pro-Ukrainian, even if they kept being Russian speakers. There was a huge transformation among these movements after 2014. A lot of movements disappeared. A lot of movements joined or fragmented. I mean, there was a whole galaxy. And the ones that emerged were a strange mix of what had originally been. The theme of Bandera itself, himself, the whole Bandera theme, the whole black and red flag, became extremely popular during Maidan throughout all Ukraine as a symbol of resistance to Russia and to Yanukovych and then to Russia when the war started. It had nothing to do with the actual history of the real UPA, which practically nobody actually knew about except in Western Ukraine, because it had never been taught during Soviet Union. It still wasn't taught in Ukrainian schools. So people are completely uninformed. Most people in Ukraine have no idea about the mass murders of Poles that took place in Volhynia in 1942, 1943, 1944, especially 43, 44. They remember it in Poland, but they didn't remember it in Ukraine. So Ukrainian historical memory about the specific events of the 40 was extremely lost. And what people remembered was that these guys, our guys, called banderci, fought the Soviet Union. Therefore, они наш, тогда они наш, тогда они хорошо. The way the population has been using this bandera symbol has very little to do with the historical reality and has very little to do with the small groups of extremists who maybe have studied the history a little bit better and really believe that Bandera is a great man because of what he actually did. All most people know is that he fought the Soviet Union, he was murdered by the Soviet Union, he was in a concentration camp during the war, so he couldn't have collaborated with the Germans because he was in a concentration camp. Actually, that's wrong, but they believe it. So it's a very simplified vision of history that has fed these myths. And it's true, it's been a real myth in Ukraine, but it's become a completely normalized, liberalized myth. I mean, I don't want to make stupid comparisons, but you could say it's as empty of content as the myth of Jeanne d'Arc in France. When people start going around marching for Jeanne d'Arc in France, it's абсолютно пустой знак. Это не имеет никакого значения. Это просто знак. И для большинства в Украине Бандера — это такой пустой знак. Это просто знак, что мы против России. Россия говорят, что мы бандерцы, пусть будем бандерцы. So, of the majority of the population. And, you cannot... Obviously, the Russians have used that in their propaganda, showing the flags, the black and red flags, showing this, showing that, to say, look, they are banderci, they are fascists, because they're playing on their own tradition of people who fought in the Red Army, whose parents, grandparents fought in the Red Army against the banderci. So look, these guys are fascists. So it's, the two discourses feed off each other, but these are all completely empty of any historical reality. They're just modern fantasy myths, again, except for the small, very motivated groups that help society somehow find a symbol, something orient itself. I mean, the truth about Ukraine is that it was, up to Maidan, Ukraine was a very diverse country. It had ethnic minorities, it still has ethnic minorities, quite a few, the Hungarians, the Romanians, the Tatars of Crimea, who've been annexed by Russia, Jews, and many others. It had very strong different national sentiment between East and West, which is not, I think, so much linked to the language issue as linked to the experience during World War II, because there's a huge difference for the people who were Soviet citizens before 1939 and the people who were Polish citizens before 1939 and were violently annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939 when the Soviet Union shared Poland down the middle with Nazi Germany, something Mr. Putin would like to forget very much today. So of course these people have completely different memories. The people in Western Ukraine, what they remember of Soviet Union is Soviet Union coming in and starting killing and deporting everybody. Okay, what the people in the East remember more is Golodomor, which did not affect Western Ukraine because it wasn't part of Soviet Union. They remember the repressions of the 30s. And then when the war came, they were invaded by the Nazis and they joined the Red Army and they fought. So there's very different historical memories in the two parts of the countries that has been very, very complicated for Ukrainian governments to address, to sort of create some kind of unified narrative. But precisely, in a way, that's kind of a good thing, because when you impose a totalitarian narrative that you fabricate, like Putin has done in Russia, this is actually not very helpful. I think it's much, the Ukrainian experience of memory, which I've been working on for the past year, so it happens I know a lot about it, is much more interesting than that, because people have been developing their own memories, and those different memories have been allowed to express themselves in sometimes extremely weird ways. Like there's a monument for Aoun at Babi Yar, which for me is just completely crazy. I mean, Aoun were Nazi collaborate. Aoun, Organizacja Ukraińskich Nacjonalistów. U nich jest pamiętnik w Babim Jarze, prima w Babim Jarze. Oni byli antysemici, oni byli kolaboranci. To była mnicka frakcja Aouna, nie banderci, no mnicki. Niemcy ich wystrzelali w 1942 году. No, do этого oni byli kolaboranci i antysemici. No, u nich jest pamiętnik w Babim Jarze, wместе z Jewryjami. Представьте, it's all very confused. But that's the sloppiness and the messiness of democracy, of free countries, of complicated countries. And actually, I think that's a very good thing. I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as a good thing, that everybody can express their very weird history and opinion in a different way. Last year I was at the huge right-wing demonstration, and it was after the gay pride demonstration, and you have those. Okay, fine, it's a free country. Why not? That's the beauty of complicated and free countries, which is that this memory could develop organically. The one thing that really, really unified Ukraine was Maidan. And now, the one thing that is really, really forever going to be the founding myth of Ukraine for the rest of its history is this war. Everything else is just details now. This war, where the entire Ukrainian people from the east, the west, from Kharkiv, from the south, from Kherson, from Lviv, are going to fight these bastards coming in with the tanks, that's now going to be the one myth of the country, the one myth that modern future Ukraine is going to be built on, is going to be this myth. And unfortunately, it is the myth that is going to be in complete opposition with Russia. Unfortunately, because the two countries are neighbors and have these ancient ties, and it should not have been like that. But this is what Putin chose, so it's how it is.
И это именно то, что меня больше всего беспокоит, потому что вот на сегодняшний день до сих пор население этих двух стран, России и Украины, оно очень тесно связано. И несмотря на всю политику последних лет, мы очень близки. Это война. Если мы спустимся с уровня государств и правительств, и президентов на очень человеческий уровень, насколько эта война произвела необратимый и фундаментальный раскол между русскими и украинцами. Этот вопрос меня очень сильно интересует, и в какой-то момент мне даже пришла такая бредовая ассоциация. Тысячелетия назад евреи и арабы тоже были очень близкими семитскими народами. И в какой-то же момент началось вот это расхождение и противостояние, которое не заканчивается веками. Мы наблюдаем, что нечто настолько же фундаментальное, и что это как бы или все-таки нет, или в 21 веке это будет иначе. Как вам кажется?
I think, Aaron, it really depends on what happens with the war. To get back to one of your earlier questions, I've been through many, many wars, and one thing that is a universal phenomenon in war, which I've seen everywhere, is that the longer it lasts, the more radicalized people get. This is a natural expression of trauma. It can take many different forms. It can become more religious, or more nationalist, or more this, or more that, but people mechanically become more radical in war. And so if the war ends now, or in the next few days, and Russia makes some kind of agreement and pulls out its troops, and we leave it at that for now, this will be a very different situation than if Russia continues bombing Ukraine for months and months and months and destroys the major cities of Ukraine. This will, in terms of the impact it'll have, psyche of the people in Ukraine and on their future relations with the Russians. I think one thing that's incredibly important is, and I've said this before in other contexts, is it's incredibly important that Russians, people, make it as clear as possible to the Ukrainian people that this is Putin's war and not Russia's war. It's not a war of the Russian people. It's a war of the Putin junta, the Putin clique, Putin corrupt little bunch of thieves, and nothing else. And so all these demonstrations, even as small as they've been in Russia, are very important. Everything on Instagram and social networks, even interviews like this, you being, I don't know if you're actually Russian, but you being in Russia and being a Russian journalist. Well, I guess you are a Russian citizen also, so yeah. So
of course.
The fact that you're doing this.
Yeah, I am Russian.
Yeah, so, this is all important because people will see this in Ukraine and will see, okay, there are people in Russia who believe differently. So it's not the Russian people, the clique, the junta, that is doing this. And I think that is very important for the future of the overall relations between the two people. What happens after this war will obviously depend very much on politics and what happens with the Putin regime, if it continues, if it collapses, what happens with Ukraine, if it's completely invaded and put under an occupation regime, or if it manages to survive the war as an independent country. So it's very difficult to predict, but the longer the war goes, the worse and worse it will be for the long-term relations between Ukrainian and Russian people. That is for sure.
Вы очень глубоко изучали историю Второй мировой, когда готовили роман «Благоволительницы». Вы ее очень хорошо знаете, я полагаю. Как то, что происходило тогда, на ваш взгляд, связано с тем, что происходит сейчас? Есть ли какие-то, во-первых, причинно-следственные связи и уместны какие-то аналогии в событиях, которые были тогда и которые начинаются сейчас?
I don't think there's any real analogy other than the analogy we made earlier of the ultra-nationalist great power ideology of the two countries. I mean, Germany was, in those days, ultra-nationalist, fascist, imperialist country that wanted to build itself a land empire in Europe. And today, Russia is, and also the whole factor of resentfulness and revenge from World War I can be compared to the Russian resentfulness and desire for revenge from the fall of the Soviet Union and the difficult years that followed and NATO expansion and so forth. So yeah, I guess there are some parallels like that. The Putin regime is a much more fake regime than the Nazi regime. Nazi regime was a real mass totalitarian movement. I mean, obviously not everybody in Germany agreed with them, but a great majority of the people loved it. You know, they really loved it. They really went for it. They really agreed with it. The anti-Semitism was incredibly deep in the population. All of Putin's ideology is a completely manufactured ideology. I still find it strange to believe that he actually believes it now, because, I mean, I watched his propagandists make this up as the years were going on because they felt like they needed something to justify all their corruption and their stealing. You know, you can't steal that much money from your country and be that corrupt without some kind of justifying narrative. So they started taking bits and pieces, Stalin, victory, World War II, Orthodox Church, Slavic this, blah, 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 blah. I mean, you know, it's been bubbling for years. People like Dugin, people like Prilepin, all these ideologists, you know, it's been like percolating. But it's completely, it's a neo-ideology. It's not a real ideology. No one except a handful of maniacs actually believes any of this stuff. It's a very thin coating trying to hide the massive corruption of this government, where the slightest head of department will probably steal $150 million in his career. You know, that's what the Russian government is. It's a mafia with a story they've cobbled together. The problem is now some of them seem to believe their story. Putin, Shoigu apparently also. And so it makes them very dangerous, but they're still an incredible minority among even their own elite, of course, the own population. I mean, I've been in contact with some very important people in Russia over the past few days, extremely important, like, you know, up in the top levels, let's say. And they're freaking out. They're like, this is just madness. What's going on? I mean, they're completely helpless to do anything about it, but they don't even understand it. So, you know, if you want to compare it to what happened when Nazism went back to war.
Well, I'm just asking if if there is a certain comparison or not.
Except for the psychological elements of the resentment and the revenge, you know, the humiliation that was felt by Germany after Versailles Treaty in 1918, and that resentment and feeling of humiliation building all through the 20s. I think there has been that same feeling among a much smaller segment of the population in Russia, but still existing, and especially among the elite. Again, it's much more of an elite phenomenon. It's not a popular phenomenon in Russia, this resentment, this sense of humiliation. I think that would be the main comparison. But otherwise, it's just what it really is about. I mean, the fundamental thing that this war is about, an illegitimate, criminal, mafiosi, corrupt government that has reached such an extreme vis-a-vis its own internal problems that it can only maintain power internally by putting everybody in jail and closing everybody down, cannot stand having a successful democratic country as its neighbor, made of the same people, because it would be such an impossible example for them to manage vis-a-vis their own population. Because everybody in Russia slowly would start thinking, well, look, if the Ukrainians can have democracy, why can't we have democracy? They live well, they have free access to the EU, they don't need visas, their economy is developing. All these are terrible examples for Putin. And I think what he really wanted to do was not so much invade to have, you know, Lebensraum like Hitler. I think he wanted to invade to put an end to the Ukrainian democratic experiment and to make sure that Ukrainian became a little puppet like Belarusia, which would be non-threatening to him in terms of the example it gives to his own population. The same way I believe that he joined Bashar al-Assad and bombed Syria, as he did all these years extremely violently, Also as an example to his own population, to show, look what happens when you challenge your vождь. Look what happens. Будьте осторожны. So, he's been very good at sending these signals ever since Maidan that, if you try this stuff with me, вам пиздец.
С другой стороны, вы упомянули, что путинская идеология – это большой фейк, в который мало кто верит, и она довольно слабая, с чем я абсолютно согласен. Я сейчас подумал, что как раз антивоенная идея и вот это сопротивление войне может быть сейчас довольно сильной объединяющей идеей, потому что мы видим, какое огромное количество людей с самыми разными политическими взглядами и экономическим положением объединяются вокруг этой простой идеи остановить войну. Потому что сегодня даже представители РПЦ подписали огромное письмо вслед за огромным количеством деятелей культуры, спортсменов, бог знает кто еще. Эта идея одинаково объединяет и коммунистов, и некоммунистов, всех представителей самых разных партий, бедных людей, которым, очевидно, по которым санкции ударят быстрее всего, и богатых, которые тоже все в шоке и ужасе. Мне кажется, эта идея, остановить войну, вполне вероятно, будет очень мощным объединяющим фактором. Первые же дни это стало очень заметно, какие разные люди присоединяются и не боятся ее высказывать.
Только можно надеяться. Только можно надеяться. Это будет, как я сказал, это будет очень хороший пример к украинцам. Что если они видят, что есть такое движение в России, конечно, это будет очень хорошо для будущего. И может быть это будет, how do you say the seed? The word?
Семечко, семя.
Да. Это может быть семечко будущего.
Тут есть другой вопрос, который все обсуждают. Про Третью мировую, естественно. Многие говорят, что это ее начало. Но мы знаем, что Вторая мировая была прямым продолжением Первой, как вы заметили только что. Все это было еще в том колониальном, индустриальном мире. Как вам кажется, возможен ли переход от такого локального конфликта Россия-Украина к глобальному? Возможно ли мировая война сегодня в постиндустриальную эру?
This is extremely difficult to say. In principle, there is absolutely no reason for this to happen. The West has been crystal clear. They will not fight in Ukraine. They will not send soldiers to Ukraine. They will not militarily confront Russia. They have said this over and over. They're now moving troops to protect their own borders in Baltic states and Poland and Romania, which is normal. But they have said, we're not going to confront you any further. What is happening in Mr. Putin's head is very difficult to say right now. And indeed, he and his entourage might consider the economic sanctions as aggression against him. And he has made threatening noises about using nuclear weapons, about, this and this and that. When you're dealing with someone who is no longer rational, which is what a lot of people are saying is happening with Mr. Putin, I'm not in a position to judge if he's rational or not, but a lot of people seem to think he has lost the rationality he used to have. Then it becomes very difficult to predict what happens. One thing is sure is that if there's an escalation, it'll come from Russia. It will not come from the West. The West is trying to contain Russia, trying to prevent it from doing further damage than it's already done. It's not trying to overthrow Putin. It's not trying to conquer Russia. It's just trying to stop this madness. So the escalation is, every step of the way has been completely one-sided. It's always Russia that has gone further and further and further and further in this madness.
Well, but the question is how much it's going to take to stop him. And would it lead to...
When you start playing with nuclear bombs, there's no possible calculations. I mean, the entire ideology and military philosophy of nuclear weapons is deterrence. It's about not using them. That's what it's been about since 1949 when Russia got the bomb up to today. We have these giant arsenals so that we don't use them. Because if we use them, we exterminate the entire planet. So we don't use them. That has been in every system, every procedure that's ever been put into place, especially after the very close calls like the Cuban Missile Crisis, has been about how to put in place, avoiding mistakes, deconfliction, make sure we get proper signaling between the two sides so that nobody makes a stupid fucking mistake. and starts a war by accident. The problem is, if one side is ignoring this, they call it the grammar of nuclear deterrence. It's called the grammar. If one side starts ignoring the grammar and starts sending signals that are not the usual signals, those signals can be misinterpreted. And when signals get misinterpreted in a nuclearized environment, then things become extremely dangerous. So it's a super dangerous thing to play with. How do you stop it is by being intelligent and just like talking. I'm assuming, I hope, that the Americans are talking not just to Putin, but that to his entire echelons, that the army is talking to Gerasimov, that the CIA is talking to the FSB, that, at every level, people are talking to their counterparts and saying, guys, we're going to go up to a certain limit, but you guys also need to stay at a certain limit, and it has to stay within those limits, because otherwise, that's how things work in the real world. But with everything that Putin's put into motion, the possibility of an accident becomes a possibility. And that's the one thing I'm the most afraid of, is that something slips out of control. I don't think Putin's gonna, in 3 weeks, decide, fuck, my forces can't take Kiev, I'm gonna nuke Kiev. I don't think it's gonna work that way. But I think there can be an accident. Somebody can get scared, misunderstand something, misinterpret something, and then things can just spiral out of control.
Я как раз хотел спросить у вас, насколько вы верите, что их, в принципе, могут как-то использовать, потому что только когда я готовился к нашему разговору, я прочитал новость, что российские ядерные боеголовки везут сейчас в Белоруссию. Зачем их туда могут везти, если, как вы правильно заметили, всю историю ядерного вооружения, оно нужно для того, чтобы его не использовать? Что он хочет показать тем, что он вчера, кажется, заявил, что их нужно привести в какую-то особую готовность, а сегодня появляется новость о том, что ракеты везут в Беларусь.
Listen, I'm really not a specialist in these questions. Nuclear deterrence is not something I've particularly studied. I don't really understand how the command and control systems work in their technical details. What I do know is there are different levels of weapons, obviously strategical and tactical, and short-range missiles and medium-range missiles and long-range missiles. What is very clear is that if Russia starts moving medium-range missiles into Belarus closer to NATO countries, Poland and the Baltic states, it's going to freak everybody out. And the only mechanical possible answer that the West is going to be able to do to that is to move their own medium-range missiles closer to Russia, because to maintain deterrence, you have to have an equal answer. And then the tension rises that much higher, and things become that much more tense and that much more dangerous. So it's a super stupid move, because you don't really need it anyways. There's nothing you can do. The thing about nuclear war, it's quite obvious, and what I'm saying is really stupid, but it's like, trying to go hunt for a fly with a giant hammer. You don't hunt for flies with hammer. Nuclear weapons, there's no gradation. In conventional war, you've got a lot of gradation. You can apply this much force, that much force, that much force. You can choose and you can calculate the gradation of violence that you apply. Targeted strikes, massive targeted strikes, incursions. You can decide where you want your level of violence be to send signals to your opponent. In nuclear war, it's all or nothing. One nuclear bomb or 1,000 nuclear bombs, it's nuclear war. So there's no escalation possible. It's either we have a nuclear war or we don't have a nuclear war. And Russia really, really, really should not be playing with this. And I think I've heard that a lot of people in Russia on television in the past year, Zhirinovsky and other commentators have been saying, yeah, we have these new weapons, we can win a nuclear war, we can survive a nuclear war. Это что? Survive a nuclear war? America's got 5,000 fucking nuclear missiles with multiple nuclear bombs. That's enough to wipe out every single medium-sized city in Russia, never mind the big ones. Russia will be annihilated, and America and Europe and all of civilization. It's like back to the 60s when everybody was terrified about civilization ending. So, they shouldn't be playing with this kind of shit. And I would hope that even if Putin's gone completely insane, that his Genstab, who are professional military, are kind of like grown-ups. And we used to say about Trump, the adults in the room, and they understand these things and are going like, ooh, we have to be a little bit more careful with this.
Ваша книга «Благоволительницы» — это такой эксперимент над читателем, когда вы пытаетесь погрузить его в голову офицера СС, довольно страшного человека. Почему, как писателю, кажется, что это вообще нужно делать? Должны ли мы сейчас пытаться понять тех, кто произносит какие-то страшные кровожадные заявления, типа министра Лаврова Сергея Шойгу, который абсолютно хладнокровно и цинично заявляет, что никакие мирные жители там не погибли, и мы делаем все в их интересах, когда уже видим, что оттуда эти мирные жители присылают нам. Почему нам нужно разбираться, что происходит в голове у таких людей?
They're different things. My character in my book is a middle-level officer. Okay, what I was interested specifically was not the psychology of the top guys. I was not interested in the psychology of Hitler or Himmler. I think you can really get into their psychology, and frankly, I honestly don't think it's of any interest. It's obviously of interest for intelligence services, for foreign governments trying to predict and analyze the behavior of the people that they are confronting. For instance, one of the documents I studied when I was writing the book was a 250-page American intelligence report compiling all the available information on Hitler's psychology. And this was a document that was for Roosevelt and for the heads of the US Army to help them in their calculations. But for me, as a writer, as an artist, there's absolutely no interest. And so to answer your question, I'm not interested in the psychology of Lavrov or Shoigu or even Putin. It doesn't matter to me. What's interesting to me in my book and also in the current situation is, between the chiefs, the top guys with their craziness and their madness and their weird decisions, and between all the completely low, ignorant, uneducated people who follow them, who are manipulated by their propaganda, there's a middle layer without which the people on top are not capable of manipulating the people on the bottom. These are the intelligent, intellectual, trained, brilliant cadres that make the backbone of a regime. You need several thousand of them, tens of thousands. The colonels, the lieutenant colonels. My character is a lieutenant colonel. These were the people I'm interested in because these are the people who are normal people who in a different reality would have gone on a completely different path. I'm talking now about my book and the Nazis, but who in this reality became the servant of that regime because that's what it was. The same with the same kind of people that made Stalin's regime possible. Stalin's regime, for me, the interest is not Stalin, Beria, and Molotov and these guys. It's the tens of thousands of middle-level guys that actually did the work of the terror throughout the entire country and made it possible. But this is obviously this is of no interest in the current situation. Why people are following Putin, his colonels are obeying orders. At this point, it's completely irrelevant. For me, it's an artistic project, it's an intellectual project, but I'm trying to understand the fundamentals of totalitarian regimes. I'm very interested in systems. What interests me is not individuals in this sense, it's systems, how systems work. Systems work with people. For systems to work, I mean government systems, administrative systems, military systems, they are made of people. And you need a critical mass of people to make these systems work. And so what interests me is how do you achieve that critical mass at the middle level to make such a machinery function. So I would be much more interested, for instance, middle-level head of department in the presidential administration of Putin. Me personally, I mean, not right now in this war, but in general as an intellectual project, then I would be interested in Putin. Because it's these guys that transmit and make possible in the world Putin's weirdness or craziness, whatever you want to call it, that make it possible. Without those people, we saw it with Trump. I mean, Trump was a very interesting counterexample because Trump was absolutely incapable of attracting competent cadres around him. In the first part of his presidency, he had very competent people who tried to control him. When they saw they couldn't control him, they all quit, which is the American democratic way. And by the last 2 years of his rule, he had nothing but completely incompetent idiots surrounding him. So there was no transmission wheel. And so he would just give orders and try to do things, but just things didn't happen because he didn't have the machine that makes things happen in the real world. He had no interest in such a machine. He had no understanding that such a thing even exists, much less attempting to understand how it functions. Even now that we're learning more and more about his coup d'etat attempt, when he tried to overthrow the election results, I mean, it went much deeper than we thought at the time. It went quite deep. It was quite elaborate, but still the people who were actually managing it were completely incompetent and were crazies. So It never got very far because everybody else just went, no, sorry, we're just not going to do that. And so it didn't work. But, you know, when you have a situation like this situation, Putin made a decision to invade Ukraine, fine. But how many people had to agree with that decision and follow that decision to put everything into place for this to become possible? That is much more interesting.
Именно для меня это тоже очень важно и интересно, потому что я тоже все время пытаюсь понять. Понятно, если ты работаешь в Министерстве обороны или в администрации президента, это один разговор. Многие из нас, как бы обычный средний класс, который, как вы сказали, не наверху и не внизу, как мы можем за собой заметить вот этот переход условно на сторону зла? Когда ты погружен в эти обстоятельства, ты находишься внутри страны, и это связано с моим другим вопросом про наши интеллигентские комплексы вины и стыд, который все сейчас так активно выражают. Как, вот, на ваш взгляд, отдельный человек должен выстраивать свои отношения сегодня с государством, в крайнем случае с этой фабрикой зла, чтобы в какой-то момент не оказаться по ту сторону своих ценностей, своей этики незаметно, как это сделал ваш герой?
It's a very difficult question. It's a very difficult question. I mean, the problem is that, I mean, there are many facets to answer your question. You know, there's what people can do today in this situation. And the answer for that is very simple. Protest, make your voice heard, whether it's through petitions or Instagram or going in the street, get arrested, and show the world that there are people in Russia who are against this. Today, it's the only thing you can do. It's pretty useless, but symbolically, it's very important. The process over the past 20 years that led us to this situation is a much more complex and deeper process, obviously in regard to the Russian intelligentsia, the Russian middle class, the Russian, and its whole relationship with the regime. Would you like me to talk about that too? You know, it started at the very beginning. I mean, when Putin came to power as president, so at the beginning of 2000, I was already working in Chechnya since the beginning of the war, so September, October, as an aid worker. I had been working in Russia previously, doing programs in prison as an aid worker, doing programs in prison and different oblasts, Dальний Восток, Turin. But as soon as they started the actual conflict in Chechnya, I transferred my operations to North Caucasus. So I was very involved in this. And I spent 1.5 years so I was 6 months in the first war, so I knew the region very well. Living in Grozny. Second war, we couldn't live in Chechnya, so we lived in Ingushetia, and then we would go back and forth all the time between Ingushetia and Chechnya. And I did this from October 1999 to January 2001, so 15 months, приблизительно. And then, you know, I had an apartment in Moscow. I lived in Moscow. I had my family there. I had a child later. So I would go back regularly to Moscow. In Moscow, I had lots of friends, полная тусовка. And we'd have parties, and там бухали. Я постоянно говорил об Чечне с ребятами. Ну вот, я только что это видел, это. И очень быстро все мои друзья, интеллигентные, среднеклассные, такие журналисты, бизнесмены, ну, разные люди, артисты и так далее. Ну, Джонатан, знаешь, Чечня, надоело твоя Чечня. Что, ребята, это не моя Чечня. Вы что, это ваша Чечня. Я иностранец здесь, я никого здесь. Это ваша Чечня, это ваша страна, это ваши соседи, это ваш власть, который это сделает. А как вы не можете интересоваться? Ну, ты знаешь, это все сложно, неприятно. And in the end, I left Russia because of this in 2003. I just got fed up with this apathy of most of the people I was in contact with. Obviously, there were a few motivated, but they were very rare, very rare. Most of my people just wanted to work, make money, have a nice life, and like forget about вот это ёбаная Чечня. Забываем об этом. And I think that was the start of a very long process. First, you know, it's like the old famous line from Germany when they came from Pastor Niemöller. They came for the Jews. We shut up. They came for the gypsies. We shut up. They came for the gays. We shut up. And then finally they came for me, and there was no one left to protest anymore. It was the same process. When they went for Chechnya, everybody's like, it's not our problem. And then they went for Georgia, not our problem. Then Crimea, Ukraine, Syria, it's never our problem, you know? And so there's been this apathy among the mass of the Russian intelligentsia and middle class, which is quite different from the internal emigration of the Soviet time. I mean, the intelligentsia in the Soviet time had this whole internal emigration thing, where they just wrapped themselves in their bubble of their friends and their kitchen and just tried to shut out what their country was doing. But internal immigration was active. It was a form of quiet protest. This wasn't even protest. It was just apathy. We want to go to restaurants. We want to go to clubs. We want to have the good life. We want to go to our vacations in Europe, and we just want to forget about all this stuff. And then, there are many events. Obviously, a lot of these people woke up in 2012 when we had Благоволительницы and came out in the streets and said, okay, no, this is the time we have to fight. And then there was the repressions. So it's not a linear process.
Вот вы вспомнили, как когда пришли за евреями, цыганами, геями, мы молчали и так далее. Просто сейчас, когда развивается эта война, как мне кажется, следующий логичный шаг – это очень мощное закручивание гаек внутри страны. И если мы посмотрим чуть-чуть вперед, те проблемы, которые сейчас вынесены за границу России, они могут оказаться внутри России, в другой форме, но против собственного населения, потому что я это вижу как очень логичный следующий шаг. Поиск внутреннего врага после того, как мы сходили на внешнего.
Это сталинистские репрессии. Это значит судить, посадить всех, которые подписали петиции, всех, которые вышли на улицу, всех, которые открывали рот, всех, которые поставили черные кадры на Инстаграме. Это следующий шаг. Это логичный следующий шаг для путинского режима. Что открывать ГУЛАГ, настоящий ГУЛАГ опять в России. Я абсолютно согласен.
Вы сказали, что выходить на улицы очищает совесть, но не сильно помогает. Но что тогда, помогает?
Я не знаю, но молчать это не вариант. Потому что пока, сейчас, Путин не так сильный, как Сталин был тогда. Это совсем другая ситуация. Путин очень в этом тупике пошел, потому что он боится свой народ, он боится российских людей. Он знает, что когда будет вот эта экономическая катастрофа, что большинство людей, которые его поддерживали, не будут его поддержать. Даже военные, они тоже обыкновенные люди, тех, которые воюют. Они не имеют семьи обыкновенной. А если они не согласны, что дальше? Это ему тупик, абсолютно. Но каждый тупик, на который он идет, надо дальше, и дальше, и дальше. Он только это знает. Like a cornered rat. I don't know how to say that in Russian. But at some point, in Ukraine, people fought. It's physical violence. Maidan was physical. It was violence. They fought. They went out with Molotov cocktails and iron bars and fought the police that had guns, and they won because there were more of them. So at some point, when you reach a dead end, a political dead end, I mean, basically there's two possible paths for Russia. Either the regime itself will do something internally, so what they call an internal coup or something, and then put somebody else and say, okay, or the pressure will mount and mount and mount till it's impossible. But, Putin cannot, if people come out in the street, not just the Moscow bourgeoisie or the St. Petersburg bourgeoisie, but in every city in Russia, in every glubini in Russia, in every городок, тогда что? Что он будет делать? He's just asphyxiating his own country. I mean, Putin keeps talking about threats to Russia. This is all he's talking about. You're threatening Russia, угроз России и так далее, и так далее. Но самый большой угроз России – это сам Путин. Это сам Путин. Это он. Самый большой угроз для его страны. Все, что Россия сделала вот эти последние 30 лет, будет разрушен благодаря господину Путина. Это просто факт. И люди будут понимать этот факт. Хоть рано, хоть поздно, они будут это понимать.
Квир-люди во времена такого тоталитарного разворота, который сейчас происходит в России, что с нами, со мной лично будет? Это важный вопрос, потому что 2 года последние мы с коллегами работали над этой темой. снимали документальное кино про то, как живут квир-люди в разных городах, кучу интервью. И все это теперь кажется совершенно бесполезным и как будто бы совершенно неуместным. Среди консерваторов и таких патриотов в России есть поговорка, что все либералы геи. Понятно, что это смешно, и это, как бы нельзя рассматривать всерьез. Из всего того, что вы знаете про историю, что во времена таких катастроф происходит с теми, кто даже в мирное время был довольно уязвим, не похож с квир-людьми?
Конечно, в России это уже сложно очень, это будет еще сложнее. Это факт, абсолютно. Почему это факт? Я считаю, что есть разные причины. There's one level where authoritarian governments, totalitarian governments, right-wing violent movements, all these types of groups, they function according to a principle of scapegoating. They need to find what's called a scapegoat. I don't know what the Russian word for scapegoat is. And the scapegoats, for the Nazis, it was the Jews, obviously, the gypsies, anti-socials, etc., etc., etc. In the current modern context, there's foreigners, always, there's gypsies, and queer people, LGBT people are clearly, in today's complex situation, a very easy scapegoat to identify, isolate, and use as a repulsive mechanism to motivate people around your ideology. We see similar dynamics in America on the Republican right-wing side of things, where also, the attack now on trans children and similar discourses to what you hear in Russia about queer people in general is quite violent. Although much more paradoxical in America because, for instance, I think Texas has the highest rate of married gay couples in all the United States. Just because Texas being more conservative, more people get married in Texas, so more gay people get married in Texas. So there are hundreds of thousands of married gays in Texas, gays and lesbians, because it's Texas. And, so it's a bit of a different situation. But still, you see the same kind of scapegoating. All these scapegoatings have some little, like we talked about семечки, there's always something at the bottom of it that makes that group a problem. If you think about it objectively, what is the difference between white people and black people? It's actually something of the order of 0.001 milligram of melanin in the body. It's an infinitesimal quantity of melanin that you couldn't even see with the naked eye throughout the whole body that makes a difference between a white person and a black person. Meaning it's absolutely nothing. There's no difference. With the whole history we've had and colonialism and the racism that developed out of Western colonialism, we have this incredibly strong anti-black racism, which unfortunately, for instance, we've seen it even playing out among refugee situations in Ukraine, where black people have been discriminated on both in Ukraine, trying to get on trains and buses, and also at the border with Poland, trying to cross over into Poland. It's extremely unfortunate. It shows that this kind of racism is still existing and prevalent among society, very unfortunately. Let's say the past 2 centuries, modern masculinity has been constructed in opposition to everything which is ambiguous, everything fluid, everything intersex. Hermaphrodites were a huge obsession in the 19th century. People were terrified of hermaphrodites because they represented that ambiguous interspace. And so gayness came to represent male homosexuality principally because early 20th century fascism really was not very interested in lesbians. They were mainly obsessed with gays, gay men, because they felt it as a threat to their own sense of how they'd constructed their masculinity. The sort of natural femininity inside men. Each gender has a component of the other. Every man has femininity in him and every woman has masculinity in them. It's just normal. The Chinese understood it very well with the whole yin-yang. It's just nature. And then there's a balance inside each individual. How much? Maybe this, maybe that. Fascist right-wing movements became absolutely terrified and were built on this fear of the internal feminization that they fantasized was associated with what they call inversion at the time. It wasn't even called gayness, it was called inversion or homosexuality, which was paradoxical because it didn't prevent a great amount of them from actually practicing homosexuality. It's quite famous with the SA and other groups. And the same today. I'm sure there's an immense number of the people in Putin's presidential administration and secret services who are gay, but openly,
publicly, they persecute gays because that's part of the whole complex, and they're gay in their own very special, probably very closeted way. But, there's a disconnect between their lives, probably, and the whole public thing that they participate in. This fear of this internal femininity always rises when you get a move to the right in regimes. You see it in America, you see it in Russia, you see it everywhere. I mean, they're sort of very intimately associated. Here, I live in a city in Barcelona, which is an incredibly liberal city where gayness is just completely normalized. It's like you don't even think about it. My children, when I told them in 2012, they were small children, when I told them that France had legalized gay marriage, they looked at me with huge eyes. It's like, what do you mean legalized gay marriage? What did they have before? And I was like, well, before they couldn't marry. And I was like, really? They couldn't marry? That's no fair. How come? And like, well, precisely, it was no fair, and now they've corrected it, so they've legalized gay marriage. It didn't even cross their minds that this was an issue. And you see men kissing in the street here all the time. You see women kissing in the street, and nobody pays any attention. It's just like, people walking their dogs. Who cares? It's just normal. It's not even curiosity anymore. It's just like gone from the public gaze. It's just become normality because this society has put its insecurities and its fears in other places. But that particular complex has been kind of eliminated from the complex of fears and insecurities that still exist here. The whole Catalan nationalism and all that, blah, 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 really still exists, but they're put somewhere else. The anti-queer violence that we've seen in Russia and persecutions are very much a symptom, obviously. They're not a cause, but they're a symptom. They're a propaganda tool because it allows Putin to show that the West is corrupt and decadent because of all this gay stuff going on and LGBT stuff. And we, Russia, are clean, religious, traditional, Pravoslavy. It allows them to have a tool to manipulate the whole hard right in the West. Although it has to be said that the hard right in the West has a very ambiguous relationship now with LGBT relations, and a lot of the extreme European right is actually getting more and more LGBT friendly because they've realized these are also voters that could vote for them, and that plenty of gay people and lesbian people will be happy to be right wing if they were more welcoming. So in France, in Holland, there's a complete shift about the relations between the extreme right and LGBT, which is historically quite interesting. But Russia's made it a focalizing point, and I have to say, it was a focalizing point in Ukraine up to this war, because
now it's gonna get worse. You mean
in Russia or in Ukraine?
In Russia,
it's possible they will, but I don't think the LGBT in Russia are going to be the biggest problem of the regime. I mean, I think they're going to have such a wide swathe of opposition that they're going to have to deal with. That, focusing, I don't think scapegoating LGBT now is going to help Putin get out of the hole he's dug himself in on Ukraine. He's got other bigger problems. So I don't think it's going to get worse than it's already been so bad. It would, difficult. But it's not by saying this is all because of the gays that he's going to get out of the problems he's gotten into economically with Ukraine. He has to find, so he's going to blame the liberals, the opposition, Navalny, it's going to be a much broader thing than just the LGBT.
В общем, многие в мире сейчас отказываются видеть разные настроения в России. И многие украинцы предъявляют очень личный счет каждому из нас за то, что мы не свергли Путина, позволили ему делать то, что происходит. И внутри страны тоже многие из нас чувствуют личную вину, личную ответственность, стыд. Эта тема у вас в книге, тема личной вины против силы обстоятельств. Как мне показалось, и вы раньше про это тоже говорили, в какой-то момент кажется, что вот этот офицер Ауэ это просто такая маленькая часть фабрики зла, и в этих обстоятельствах, как вы сказали, он просто оказался среди палачей, а не среди жертв. И вот мы себя спрашиваем, что мы могли сделать, как мы могли этого не допустить. Насколько вот это чувство коллективной вины правильное и уместное чувство, на ваш взгляд? Насколько оно определяет отношение в будущем русских к самим себе и всего мира к русским людям?
I think I have to answer this question a little bit brutally. Which is to say that from the Ukrainian point of view, which would also be closer to my point of view, we unfortunately don't really care how people in Russia feel. We care about what people in Russia do. I think what's important right now is the actions people take. People's feelings, if people feel bad, if people feel guilty, all I can say is tough shit, because people in Ukraine feel a lot fucking worse. This is a fact. It's a sad fact, it's a brutal fact, but it's a fact. I talked earlier about the apathy of the Russian intelligentsia all these 20 years, about the way they turned their back on all the problems of their country and everything their country was doing, except for some moments like 2012. There are people in the country that have been fighting this entire time, that have been incredibly, wonderfully determined to bring down the Putin regime, like Navalny and his very courageous actions in coming back and facing jail just because, fuck you, we have to do something. All the people around him, the people from Memorial. But it's not enough. Everybody in Russia who is against this has to do something at some level. What it is, I don't know. I understand that in a totalitarian situation, it's very difficult to do anything without getting put in jail or without, having your lives destroyed. But again, I think it's a question of actions and not a question of feelings. And I think it's really, really now up to Russian society to use these feelings, maybe of shame and guilt, and people like you and other intellectuals and middle-class people in Russia have, to try to find new ways to resist your regime. Because the only thing that makes any difference is resistance. It's the only thing. Sitting at home and feeling bad does nothing for anybody. But resistance, any kind of resistance, from the smallest tiny little black box on Instagram to Navalny, that's already something. And when you resist, there's danger. People pay with their careers, sometimes with their lives. Nemtsov was killed, Anna Politkovskaya was killed, so many other people. But without resistance, what the Russian people think, that's not in agreement with Putin is pretty much irrelevant.